Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Infuse Your Future, the podcast where we bring together people and ideas who are making a positive difference in the world. Today, I have a special guest speaker, Dr. Aaron Kaplan. Dr. Kaplan is a psychologist from Hawaii and also has his own podcast called Mind Tricks Radio. Today, we're going to be talking about black and white thinking, otherwise known as all or nothing thinking or dichotomous thinking. So without further ado, let's get into it. Well, good morning, Dr. Kaplan.
Good morning, Carla. How are you?
I am doing great. Welcome to the Infuse Your Future podcast. I'm really excited to have you on as a guest speaker today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here as well.
So why don't you start by telling the audience a little bit about who you are and why you're here today and what you do in the world.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm a clinical psychologist. I live in Honolulu, Hawaii. I've been here probably for about 30 years now. And I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm in private practice. I do a variety of different kinds of clinical activities. I do individual therapy with patients. I do some groups, couples counseling, family therapy. I have practicum students and interns that sometimes rotate through my site, so I train them. We do a lot of neuropsychological assessments and diagnostic evaluations and those kinds of activities. So kind of have my hands in a lot of pieces of the clinical psychology pie.
That sounds exciting. So I'm just curious, what inspired you to become a psychologist?
Yeah, I've always been really interested in psychology. My dad was a animal behaviorist when I was growing up. So I was around monkeys a lot, of all things. And he was doing attachment theory types of research with squirrel monkeys. I found that very, very fascinating. And so I got an interest in psychology from that early on. I took a class in high school that was very inspiring as well. I really enjoyed that. And as I got to learn more about psychology as a field, to me, it was very fascinating, just trying to understand and learn about how the mind works and how people function. I really love the idea that a person's problems or issues they're dealing with could be solved through talking, just through communication, through working through issues. A person who has whatever severe anxiety problems, depression, interpersonal issues, just through talking could gain so much benefit. And I found that to be very powerful, the workings of the mind and the ability to be able to affect that through clinical work. Also, I think my parents always thought I'd probably be a lawyer because, I argue a lot and I'm very good at sort of weaving arguments and speaking. And, I considered becoming a lawyer. And when I kind of weighed the options, I thought okay, lawyer or clinical psychologist? Am I going to use my gift of gab for the forces of evil or for the forces of good here? And again, I'm just being dramatic. I don't see lawyers as evil, but I thought that if I got involved in law, I would end up being very antagonistic in the way that I was using my abilities, and that using them for the benefit of helping people directly and clinically would be more meaningful for me. So I think I figured that out early on as well.
I love that. And I love that your dad was an animal behaviorist, you said?
Yeah. So he was studying squirrel monkeys and attachment behavior. It was really fascinating work that he was doing. In fact, he was, I think, the only person in the world that was able to establish a colony of squirrel monkeys outside of the wild. He had this cage that was the size of a football field. It was over at Stanford. And
wow.
we would get to go in, and the monkeys would be in the trees and they'd be playing, and he would have ways of observing them, naturalistic observations, and study their behavior, and really interesting stuff. So that was very inspiring to me too. I grew up around a lot of monkeys.
That reminds me of, because I know you have a podcast, and I remember you doing a podcast on an elephant that got loose in Hawaii.
Yeah.
I wonder what your dad thought about that.
Yeah, well, that was a really tragic episode in the history of Hawaii, where Tyke the elephant was a circus elephant that had been brought here and just sort of lost it and just bursted out into the boulevard and knocked over cars. And it was a really, really awful incident. And I interviewed my colleague, Dr. Tyler Ralston, who at that time was a young man, and he witnessed the whole thing. He was out on the street, and it was very traumatic for him. So in that episode, we talked a bit about, trauma and also just kind of animal cruelty.
Right, right. Yeah, and that brings me to your podcast. I know you have a great podcast called Mind Tricks Radio, I believe.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, which I love.
Thank you.
I've listened to quite a few episodes. I know the second one you had to do with empaths. And that really resonated with me because I found out that I'm an empath. I was just listening for fun. And that led me along a path that I started learning about boundaries and how to set my own boundaries, which has helped a lot in my own life. But I was curious because I love your podcast. I mean, what got you into podcasting?
Yeah. So, I kind of like throughout my life and my career, I've always taken this approach of wanting to try new things, challenge myself with new challenges, and always sort of push my range of knowledge and experience and understanding. And I just been thinking for a while that doing a podcast would be a fun and interesting challenge. And I also thought that it would be very helpful to do episodes that I could have for my patient population. So oftentimes, I talk about various different kinds of topics, and I would love the idea of having sort of a body of interviews where I could say, what we're talking about right now, highly sensitive people and empaths. Well, go back and listen to episode 2, because I interviewed Trisha Burke, who's an expert on highly sensitive people, and listen to that, and let's talk more about you when you come back. And so that was really, really helpful to have these episodes that would be helpful for my patients, and they share with other people. About, I'd say, 75% of my episodes are interviews with people, and maybe about 25% are solo episodes. I decided I wanted to record a few episodes on some topics that come up again and again and again in my practice, and it would be a helpful resource to refer patients to. And then more recently, I kind of got into this sort of what I'm calling this distortion of the week, where I was recording these 10-minute blurbs about various different cognitive distortions and doing it more of a humorous and fun kind of way. And I think that's where you maybe picked up on, the concept of black and white thinking, which we're going to talk a bit about today. But that's sort of it. It's fun, it's interesting, it's a valuable resource. I don't know if I'm going to be doing it forever. It's a project that'll have its, life course, and we'll sort of see where it goes.
Yeah, I love all that. And I was listening to another podcast recently, and the gentleman was saying one of the reasons he does it is every person he interviews, he learns so much about the topic they're doing, about the person, and that he could never learn as much if he just tried to go off on his own. And I found that's true with me as well.
He's 100% correct about that. It's the best source of continuing education any kind of clinician could have, because it's true with every topic. At least in my case, I'm reading their book, or I'm reading their articles, I'm studying, and I learn so much, and it really, really enhances my practice. So I couldn't agree more with that.
As you mentioned, today's episode is all about black and white thinking, and I want to thank you for coming on and discussing it. And I was telling you right before we started that it couldn't be more perfect today, because I am filming this podcast from our local library, and I just picked a conference room, and it ended up being in the children's section. So if you hear children sort of screaming in the background, it's because this is being recorded at a children's library. And the reason why I'm relating it to black and white thinking is when I first got here, I was freaking out. I was like, oh my God, I was trying to find a different conference room. And then I just stepped back, and I'm like, no, this is going to be awesome. And just sort of expanded my thinking and sort of embraced all of the positives, one of which is people are going to be less sensitive to the fact that I'm talking in this conference room because there's screaming kids all around.
Yeah, well, what you're displaying there is what we call a cognitive flexibility. You're able to take a situation and be able to bend with it and not feel so rigidly attached to the way that things are supposed to be or attached to expectations of how they should be. And that's a very valuable skill in thinking and navigating the world. So that's a great way to reframe that.
Thanks. So how would you describe what is black and white thinking for the people that don't really understand it?
Yeah. Well, first, before I get into black and white thinking, let me just mention that black and white thinking is a form of what we call a cognitive distortion. And cognitive distortions are very common. We all use them all the time. I mean, they're very, very common. And black and white thinking is just sort of one form of them. They're all related in different ways. And basically, a cognitive distortion is when you have a way of thinking about something going on in the world or going on with you, and it's not really quite rationally accurate. When you really take a step back and you look at the facts of what's happening, the way that you're thinking about that thing is not accurate. It's a distortion. And so we have lots of them. And in my podcast, as I mentioned, I did these distortions of the week. I've talked about catastrophic thinking, black and white thinking, personalization, overgeneralization. They're all related in different ways, but they're ways that we distort, our thinking about things. And so black and white thinking is one of them.
Oh, that's awesome. Do you have some common examples of the pitfalls that people fall into when they how can they recognize that they're in this black and white thinking pattern?
Yeah. So black and white thinking is sort of like, there's other ways to be able to describe it. Black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking, dichotomous thinking. Usually with this cognitive distortion, people see things as one extreme or another when they're looking at things. It's sort of all or nothing, which is almost never the case with the world around us. The world is a lot more nuanced and there's gray area there. So when we think about something in a particular way, and that way is kind of extreme, it's usually not entirely accurate. So, examples of black and white thinking, I can come up with some that I've used in the past. And let's talk about cello, because I'm into cello these days because my son is playing cello in the orchestra.
Wow.
So there's a lot of cello going on. So, and I'm just going to make this up. It's a hypothetical. It's the example I used in my episode about black and white thinking. So imagine you want to be in the orchestra and there's 3 tiers of the orchestra. And let's say tier 3 is sort of beginner, tier 2 is intermediate, and tier 1 is like the real advanced, the top-notch ones. And you are trying to get into the orchestra and you audition and you make it into tier 2, the middle tier. And you're telling yourself, oh man, I really suck. What am I? It's this tier 1 people. Those are the good people. And I'm in tier 2. I'm sucky. I'm sucky at the cello. I'm not very good. And those are the good people. And I'm the sucky people. And God, maybe I should just not do this. I'm not good at this. And this isn't my thing. But that might be an example of black and white thinking, because you're seeing it as an all or nothing. Either I'm in tier 1 and I'm good, or I'm not in tier 1 and I'm bad. But obviously, that's not accurate, because, oftentimes the people who were in tier 1 started in tier 2, or they were in tier 3. So they weren't automatically in the best tier. They started and they made their way up. Now you're in tier 2 and you're calling yourself not a good cellist, but there are people in tier 3 who are worse than you. So actually, you're kind of in the middle in terms of skill level, but that's sort of irrelevant anyway, because you're not either all good or all bad at the cello. You're somewhere in the middle, and there's room for improvement, and it's a continuum. It's not a black and white. So that would be an example, black and white thinking there.
Yeah, I was thinking, especially these days, I feel like black and white thinking is just exploding, unfortunately. Especially in the US, with all the politics and, even in religion. I just feel like there's too much, it either is or it isn't. One of my favorite memes that I like to share is a picture of the number six, because depending on which end you're standing on it, it's either the number six or the number nine. And it's just basically a really easy visual way of saying, just because somebody else has a different viewpoint, it doesn't mean that it's wrong. Just kind of expands the thinking.
Yeah. Well, and not only that, you know, when you talk about politics, it's an interesting thing because politics are often so polarized now, at least in the US. And so somebody can have a different view than you. But if that person has a different view, then they're totally different than you. Like it's like black and white thinking. If this person has a different belief than me, then we're completely different and we're on opposite end of the spectrums. And if you just look at, like, for example, in the US, the two-party system, right? There's Democrats, there's Republicans, there's other smaller parties, but they're insignificant right now in our political process. And people often see, like, if I'm a Democrat and you're a Republican, we're enemies. We've got nothing in common. We're completely different. And it's so polarized like that. But actually, life is a lot more nuanced. People who are Democrats or people who are Republicans could actually have a lot of ideas or things that they have in common that are more similar than different. But we tend to see ourselves as polarized into groups, and we separate ourselves like that. And so that's black and white, and it's very dangerous. And it's a reason why as far as politics are concerned, I don't align myself with a political party anymore, because I just don't think that's really helpful in this day and age to identify yourself with some party and have this polarized relationship with other groups of people.
Yeah. And it's so sad, really, isn't it? Because my personal feeling is we have many, many more similarities than we do differences. Like, to me, our differences are pretty small in the grand scheme of things. But the problem is we focus so much on the negative, on the differences, that we just miss everything else. And for me, it's not even just seeing shades of gray, it's seeing so much color in there. Like, you have the two extremes, then you have this whole beautiful, diverse, expansive world in between that you're just missing out on if you're not able to kind of expand your thinking.
Yeah. And I think with people, oftentimes that is a real factor. Like, in another example I give is these two realtors are trying to sell a house together. They're both co-selling this house, and they need to stage the house. And one realtor says, well, I think we should do it in sort of a Japanese minimalist style. And the other one says, oh, I think it should be a Norwegian chic or whatever. One says, let's have carbonated water. And the other says, no, I think we should have juice. One says, we should have some classical music, and the other one says jazz. And then, they go home and they tell their spouses, like, oh my God, I have to sell this house with this person. We're completely different. We got nothing in common. How can we work together? We're just opposites, But if you really dug in, like, well, number one, they both have a common objective and goal of selling this house. They both want to do that. And maybe they have some ideas of where they want to put the guest book, or maybe they have some ideas of sort of like strategies about where they want to price the house and how they're going to negotiate on it. But they're focusing in on the things that they don't have so much in common. And then they see themselves as completely opposite from each other. That's where they focus. Again, that's an example of black and white thinking, especially like in personal relationships.
And I think I briefly touched on this. I don't think in this episode, but I'm interested in trauma and have already completed a trauma recovery certification course, and I'm currently in an advanced trauma recovery certification course. And this comes up a lot in trauma, particularly developmental trauma, the black and white thinking there, that either I'm a good person or I'm a bad person, either I'm flawed or imperfect. And then we have all this stuff going in our mind where we're just beating ourselves up, criticizing ourselves because we make a tiny mistake, or, if we happen to say an unkind word to someone, we're automatically a bad person. And, then You start beating yourself up. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that, especially being a psychologist.
Yeah, well, Carla, that's our bread and butter right there. I mean, that's the most common thing, that people come in and they hate themselves. They look for every reason why they're just these awful, horrible, pathetic, terrible people. And they focus on their perceived flaws or the things that they perceive about themselves that are not okay. And not only are they just sort of not the way they like to be, but they're completely awful. And any amount of evidence to the contrary doesn't seem to help them change the way they see about themselves. They tune that out and they focus on the things that they perceive are negative or terrible about themselves. And that's very, very common. And in my therapy practice, we spend a lot of time examining those, those are irrational beliefs, and questioning the patient about the rationality and the accuracy of that, and trying to find evidence or data to the contrary to help them see like things are more nuanced. And, you take a look at just something like, I had a patient yesterday where we were talking about, her image of herself, her body image. She's a teenage girl. And, of course, everything about her is just completely disgusting and revolting, right? In her eyes. I mean, she's picking out on her nose shape, her cheeks, things where you're looking at her and I don't see any of this. Frankly, you look like a very pretty teenage girl. But it's just like, minor things that are evidence to her that she's sort of like this repulsive monster. And, the self-image that people internalize about themselves and focus on is a big part of why people come to therapy, is because of the self-loathing and the self-hatred that comes along with that. Of course, none of it's ever true. I mean,
Yeah, and I guess particularly in teenagers, right? Teenagers have a special predilection to focus and nitpick on their flaws. Would you say that's an accurate statement?
Well, I think teenagers can be particularly sensitive to that because their bodies are changing and they haven't had a lot of practice learning how to love and appreciate themselves for who they are and cut themselves break. And it's an awkward time, obviously. They're discovering romance and love and interest and love partners. And so they're very self-conscious about that. It's really, really raw for teenagers.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if we could touch on a little bit some of the ways that we can overcome this type of thinking. Like if we're really committed to self-growth and, we want to be able to expand our circles and talk to people that have differences. I know I'm lucky to have, some friends that are willing to go out of their comfort zone. One in particular deliberately goes out and tries to find people that are different from her and have conversations with people that believe differently from her so that she can expand her mind and grow. And I think this is such an important concept that I hope becomes more prevalent and kind of viral, honestly, in our society, is trying to go out and have deep conversations with people regardless of what they believe. So I guess it's a twofold question. What would be your advice if you wanted to go out and if you were to meet someone outside and they have black and white thinking, how should people handle that? And then also the black and white thinking in our own minds.
Well, let's start with number 2, because I think that one is a little clearer and more useful probably. And then we could touch on number 1 if you want to. So first off, like what you mentioned about stepping outside of the comfort zone and trying to talk to new and different kinds of people, that concept in general, just I really, really love. I mean, just the idea about stepping outside one's comfort zone and taking risks in general in life is so important, because it's one of the only ways that you can really see concretely that there's a different way of experiencing the world than what you're used to inside your own head. And if you're doing the same thing day after day, you're interacting with the same people, you have the same activities, it is hard to get a bit of a shift. So for me, like the number one thing has always been travel. I've done a lot of international travel. I lived in Nepal early on in my life, and I've traveled to many different countries. And for me personally, that has been the best way for me to sort of understand that there are multiple perspectives and ways, nuanced ways of seeing the world. Because when you're in another country and everybody around you is doing things completely different than how you're doing them or how you're perceiving them, it's sink or swim. You're not going to go around, you're not going to be able to convince an entire population that they're doing something differently than you and it's wrong. You have to adapt. So traveling, putting yourself in new and unique situations, meeting new and different kinds of people, having different experiences, taking risks that are uncomfortable is always a great way to broaden your mental flexibility and cognitive flexibility around the world. So I love the fact that you mentioned that, and I endorse that wholeheartedly as a lifestyle choice to try to do that. Now, specifically with one's own thinking, let's say a person is prone to cognitive distortions. We all are. It's not pathological or anything, or black and white thinking specifically. Like what I encourage people to do, and all my therapy patients, they learn how to do this, is to become aware as much as possible of their own cognitive processes. Stop, take a step back, think about what you're thinking and feeling and why you're thinking and feeling that way. That's a big power of psychotherapy, is to become more aware and insightful of your own mentation and your own responses. So let's just say something happens, we're involved with something, and we have a very strong reaction to it, a very strong emotional reaction. We feel uncomfortable, we feel anxious, we have a strong experiences with it. I would say to somebody, take a step back and ask yourself, what are you thinking and feeling about this situation right now? Well, this boy didn't want to go with me to the cafeteria, and he thinks that I'm this ugly duckling, and it's, I'm so stupid, and he doesn't like me, and it means I'm unlovable, I'm unwantable, and I'm just going to go, hide in the girls' bathroom this whole period and, disappear. All right. Well, that's a strong reaction you're having. How true is that nobody loves you, you're unlovable, you're really this ugly duckling? Are there any other possible pieces of evidence or data that don't quite align with that? Well, my friends the other day said I look really pretty when I was wearing, this outfit, and I had done my hair in a particular way. Okay, well, clearly there's some people there who don't think you're an ugly duckling, and we don't even know if this boy thinks you're an ugly duckling. That's your own interpretation of it. But we don't have any clear evidence. You certainly can't make the conclusion here that you're ugly. It doesn't make sense with the evidence and data we have. So stop, ask yourself, what are the thoughts I'm having? Are they really supported by this? Or is there a more nuanced and gray area here? Sure, this boy might not have liked me for whatever reason. It may not have anything to do with me personally, but it doesn't mean all of these things about me that I've internalized and I'm telling myself are true, these awful things I'm saying. So we need to stop, think about our thinking, ask ourselves, are we thinking in these extremes, this black and white way? And is there another way that's a little bit more nuanced and gray that we could be approaching this? In almost every situation in life there is, because nuance and gray is the way the world works. Black and white is not the way it works.
Yeah, so true. So true.
You asked about the first one. How do we deal with other people who are engaging in black and white thinking? That's a tough one.
Besides just running for your life.
Yeah, gosh. I mean, that's a tough one. I mean, I can give you the response of how a therapist would deal with that. In real life, it can be a little bit more complicated, I guess, because you may or may not be so invested in trying to help that person change their thinking. I mean, you can't change somebody's thinking. A person needs to decide they want to change it on their own. But I would say the best sort of general suggestions I could give is, if somebody is engaging in some kind of a cognitive distortion, stop and listen to them and talk with them about it. Let them express, what their belief is, why they think these way. Ask them questions. Get them to think on their own about the things that they're saying. And hopefully they can catch themselves in some of their own thoughts that don't make a whole lot of sense, and gradually be able to shift that as they're gaining some greater awareness of their own thinking process. That's always going to work a lot better than if we just tell somebody that they're wrong.
So true. And there are a lot of real world scenarios where this could happen, right? With a spouse, with a parent, with a boss, with a teacher, and particularly, excuse me, particularly when there's a power differential. And I guess this could be a topic for an entire another podcast, but I think the advice you just gave is great and could be useful in any situation.
Yeah, it can be useful in any situation. And I think, coming back to marital relationships, that's obviously an important one, because, husbands and wives often have big disagreements about the way that they look at things and see things. And it can be very frustrating. And it's very easy for that to devolve into arguments about who's right and who's wrong. And, again, if you take a step back and you really look at the thing that people are arguing about, usually what they're arguing about, the content of it isn't actually what the real argument is actually about. And so if you can take a look at, why is this person arguing that point? You can usually have a bit more understanding and empathy about where they're coming from. And then the reality of what the answer is, again, is more in the middle. It's more nuanced than one person's point of view is right and the other person's is wrong. And so that's very, very important in a marital relationship to try to see that. It's not easy, right? Because you live together and you're just bickering about things, and you don't have the time to be so empathetic all the time, like you're, George Clooney on, what was that movie, that series, ER, whatever it was.
Oh, I loved ER.
Yeah, right. But real life is usually moving a little quicker. Like, the doctors don't have time to sit down with a cup of coffee and really talk about your problems. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here. But it is very, very important, because people are not black and white. They're nuanced, but they just don't always know how to express that in the proper sort of way.
And I think that's especially true when you're married to someone from a different culture. And I think that's the key, right? To just speak with empathy, not be defensive, just be curious about what they're doing and why they're doing it, and ask questions, rather than be defensive, and, look for your commonalities.
Yeah, when I address cognitive distortions with my patients, I always try to take with them sort of a kind of a teamwork approach. Like, okay, you're beating up on yourself, you're self-loathing, you're hating on yourself. This doesn't feel good to you. Let's take a look at what kinds of things you're saying to yourself that are making you feel so badly about yourself. And I'm just curious, what are these things you're saying? And are they really true? I don't like seeing you hating yourself so much. You don't like hating yourself so much. So let's see if we can figure this out. I think that, there's a way for me to be that lawyer in the therapy office without browbeating and badgering, which is what I would have done if I became a lawyer. It's a different approach.
I'm so glad you became a psychologist instead of a lawyer.
Me too.
Well, I want to honor your time. So I just wanted to know if you had anything that you wanted to wrap up regarding this topic. If any final words?
Yeah, I mean, nothing too profound. I would say that there's tons of resources available for people if they're interested in learning or understanding more about cognitive distortions specifically. I mean, you just Google cognitive distortions and all sorts of things will come up. And it's very helpful to understand what the cognitive distortions are, so that you can become more aware of when you might be employing them. I just think as sort of a thought exercise and being more self-aware, it's very, very helpful. And many of the cognitive distortions, they really have a lot in common. So one way that a person may be thinking about something might be both black and white thinking and catastrophic thinking at the same time. There's a lot of overlap, but I think it's very, very helpful to be aware of them. So yeah, tons of resources out there. I don't have any specific thing to recommend, but just Google cognitive distortions, irrational thinking, styles of irrational thinking, and all sorts of things that will pop up that might be helpful.
No, that's great advice. So if people wanted to look for you directly, do you only see people in person? Do you see people virtually?
Yeah, I see people in person and I do virtually. Obviously, COVID sort of changed the ball game quite a bit. So I was like maybe 95% in person until COVID, and then it became 100% virtually during the pandemic years. And now I'm seeing people in person again, but I'm still doing virtual. So it's a combination of those. My website is www.waikikihealth.com, and there's some information about me if you're interested. There's a link to my podcast there, which can also be found on Apple, iTunes podcasts, and Spotify, and all the major podcatchers. Yeah, I have a blog there that kind of supplements the podcast. So information about me, www.waikikihealth.com.
Yeah, thanks. And the beauty about this type of stuff is that people can change and grow regardless of whether they have money, resources. If you have the money and resources, then you can work with a psychologist or a therapist or a coach. And if you don't, there's the library, there's the internet, there's just tons of resources out there. So, hopefully people will check it out and join the conversation and be less black and white.
Yeah, well, in this day and age, and with all the information available at our fingertips, there really are so many resources and podcasts, blogs, articles, YouTube videos. So yeah, I encourage people to access all of that information. And sometimes a therapist can help just sort of consolidate that information and make it more personally relevant. So sometimes people, they gather the information and they know just enough, but they're not quite sure how to apply it to themselves. And that can be helpful for that as well. But yeah, like anything else, access the resources there are available to yourself and become your own student of your own mind. And I think that's really important for people.
Like you said in the beginning of the podcast, it's amazing how much just talking about something can help. And I know there's a great resource if you're a trauma survivor, by Pete Walker is the author.
Mm-hmm.
And then the book is called Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. And one of his 4 criteria for healing is what he calls verbal ventilation, which to me is essentially talk therapy, just being able to talk about it, get it out there, and preferably with someone professional who can reflect it back in a positive way and not take you down on just a path of complaining and not growing.
Yeah, well, of course, I agree wholeheartedly with that statement, that talking about issues and problems can be very helpful for people. And I love working with all of my patients. I love working with them, but particularly in this sense, working with men can be very, very rewarding, because oftentimes males are not socialized to talk about their thoughts and feelings the same way females are. It's a major generalization, obviously. It depends on the individual. But a lot of times the men, when I get them in therapy, they've been egged on by their wives or their girlfriends for months, and they drag their feet. They don't want to go. And then finally they show up and they're real nervous and they're, they're uncomfortable, the idea that they actually have to talk about themselves. And by the end of the first session, they're like, wow, I never knew that this could be so awesome and amazing. Like you didn't bite my head off. You didn't tell me like I was a horrible person or a sissy or whatever they might have worried about. And they get so much relief out of being able to just talk to somebody about what's really going on for them. And just, yeah, the act of doing that alone for so many people is just so valuable for them.
So true. Well, thank you so much for giving us your time today. I really appreciate it and had a lot of fun.
Thanks so much, Carla. This was a lot of fun. It was a pleasure being on the show, and I appreciate you having me.
All right. I'll put all of your information down in the show notes so that people can check you out if they want to.
All right. Thanks so much. Aloha.
Okay. Bye. Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to today's episode with Dr. Erin Kaplan, all about Black and white thinking. And as you know, I like to end each episode with a call to action. So my call to action today is this. Start catching yourself with what you're thinking. And if you find yourself in an all or nothing thinking situation, just stop and get curious and find evidence to the contrary. So for instance, you're walking along and you make a little mistake and you catch yourself thinking, God, I'm such an idiot. And I'm never going to be able to get this project done or be able to get this done. Stop, reevaluate, list 10 reasons why you're not an idiot. Over time, your thinking will expand and become more nuanced and more full of life and color, and you'll have more confidence in yourself. Please share this episode with at least 3 of your closest friends and have a conversation. Bye.